Well, you're watching the Easter Friday edition of Morning Live. Thanks so much for being with us. Now, as the country celebrates Easter this weekend, many communities in KwaZulu-Natal have been left homeless by the floods that resulted in the loss of at least 341 people. And that number is still counting. The devastating impact of the damage caused by the torrents, which resulted in the destruction of homes, businesses, and public infrastructure, is yet to be calculated. Earthlife Africa's Senior Programs Coordinator, Thabo Sibeko, joins us now to talk about the effects of climate change and also the Presidential Climate Change Commission that has started to work with communities on a framework for a just transition to move to low-carbon society, which will help in the mitigation against climate change factors in the future. Thabo, thanks for your time. Welcome to Morning Live.
Thank you very much. Morning to you and morning to the viewers.
So just looking at the latest from eThekwini, from a climate change perspective, what causes these type of torrential rains that resulted in the floods that we are seeing in eThekwini and other parts of KZN and the Eastern Cape?
Okay, thank you for the question. This downpour is caused by the way we generate electricity or energy in South Africa. Warming up the planet causes climate change, leading to a lot of damage to the environment and human health. So what we see happening in KZN is as a result of climate change.
So just to back up a little bit there, Thabo, you say it's as a result of climate change, it's as a result of our mining activities in South Africa that this is currently happening. I would have thought that perhaps more impacted by what has been done in more industrialized countries and how that is impacting on us. But you say it's our own doing. So please explain that more.
Yes, it's basically the human-caused climate change as a result of the industries, the mining activities, also the existence of the coal-fired power stations in our country, where you find a lot of power stations, they do a lot of pollution. Also, the mining activities are also degrading the environment. So what is actually happening at the moment is as a result of all these industrial activities which are polluting our atmosphere.
But I guess what I'm trying to get at is, yes, we have our own issues with regard to pollution currently, but is what we are seeing in terms of climate change and the effects thereof in South Africa currently, is it as a result of what we are doing right now, have been doing over time, or are we now seeing the impact of what's happened elsewhere and our own chickens still on the way coming home to roost?
Yes, I mean the issue of industrial pollution, particularly from the mining activities as well as the pollution that comes from the coal-fired power stations, has been happening for quite a long time in South Africa. So what we see today is as a result of what has been happening over the years. So if you remember very well, in 2008, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released a climate report, trying to warn us to move away from the business as usual, to try and shift from the way we do things to a better way in order to save the environment and also to save the human health. But recently that study has again been released, showing that very little has been done. And by the look of things, we don't have a lot of time. We have very little time to actually change our systems and the way we do things in terms of industrialization. So what we actually see happening now, it's actually a call to say we need to move away and we have to move with some degree of speed because we don't have time. So what we see in KZN is actually a clear indication that indeed we really need to do something about it in order to save the planet, because the planet has got no way to negotiate with us. All that it does, it's actually retaliating against what we have been doing in terms of the industrial pollution in the atmosphere.
So from your work with communities, Thabo, and you've worked with communities in Limpopo, Gauteng, the Eastern Cape, what are ordinary South Africans saying to you? What do they understand about climate change and what needs to be done?
Most people at the grassroots level are struggling to establish connections on the way electricity is generated and the repercussions as a result. So I would say that there is still a lot of work to be done to ensure that people understand. So a lot of people are still lagging behind in terms of information about climate change. However, others regard climate change as a greatest threat to their livelihoods, because you would have, for an example, local farmers who cannot be able to farm because it has not been raining for some time. And when it rains, it actually pours, and which destroys a lot of their crops. So a lot of people, ordinary citizens, I must say that they are really struggling, and most of them, they are unaware that the adverse effect of climate change that we are seeing is as a result of industrial activities and some of the human activities. So people are struggling to make those connections to be able to understand what causes climate change.
So we have the Presidential Climate Change Commission. Let's talk about their work. And it's, of course, meant to guide South Africa's response to the climate crisis. But let's talk about the work that has been done. And I also want to know from you whether you think that this initiative is doing enough at the moment and whether it's been taken seriously by citizens.
Okay, I must say that to start with, the Just Transition Framework, it's basically a planning tool to achieve a just transition in South Africa. So its purpose is to set out the actions that the government and its social partners will take to achieve a just transition, and outcomes to be realized in short-term and medium and long-term achievements. So I think this is a step towards the right direction. So I must say that the Presidential Commission on Climate Change, in my opinion, I think they are doing their best to address the climate crisis that we are facing. I mean, to have a Presidential Commission on Climate Change, it simply means that government is finally realizing that something has to be done with the climate crisis that we have. So, so far, I think the Climate Commission has already started a stakeholder consultation process, to try and address the climate crisis, because to talk about the Just Transition Framework and on how best we can move forward and we can transition from the current system. So which I think it's a step towards the right direction. So I would say that speed is only useful only if we go into the right direction. So at the moment, a lot of people might say that the Climate Commission, the Presidential Commission on Climate Change, is actually moving very slowly. But I would say that in order for us to ensure that we are moving towards the right direction, definitely no one has to be left behind. And if we don't want to leave anyone behind, we should expect some bit of a pace which will allow everyone to be involved, but also without delaying. So I think what we probably need to see now from this commission is basically we need to see action, and acceleration of a just transition to low carbon economy for the current and the future generation.
So you said earlier, Thabo, that at grassroots level, people are failing to connect with this issue. So here's an opportunity. What does the just transition entail?
I think the just transition entails moving away from the current system. But also, moving away from the industrial system to a low carbon development of doing things. But moving away also means that taking along everyone. There are a lot of issues with regards to the just transition. Number one is the issue of jobs, particularly from the mining industry and as well as the industrialization. When we move, doesn't mean that no one has to lose their jobs, but I think we're doing this for the interest of the planet, but also the livelihoods of the communities on the ground is also critically important. So how do we transition and to ensure, how do we implement a sustainable just transition to ensure that no one is left behind and no harm is actually caused in the transitioning process, but also no one is actually losing their jobs as a result of the transition. So the just transition entails moving away from the industrialization to a low carbon development system that will actually ensure that the current generation is not living so that the future generation does not benefit what the current generation is actually benefiting today.
So what are the timeframes for that transition?
Well, I think there are targets which have been set. There are international targets. People are talking about net zero by 2050. So the just transition is actually also working towards the international targets that have been set. But seeing that the climate catastrophe is actually exacerbating in South Africa, so I think we need to move with some degree of speed. Even though the just transition, it's a process which takes time, and to ensure that no one is left behind. So, but the transitioning process is actually happening within the set international and local targets. So, what I can say also is that the Presidential Commission on Climate Change, as I've indicated earlier, that they recently did the stakeholder consultation process, and that process is still continuing. That is a clear evidence that there's some kind of an emergency that is actually happening to try and shift and to also try to meet the targets the international targets that have been set to mitigate climate change.
So how do you respond to critics who would say that South Africa is always at the forefront, always very quick to ratify all sorts of treaties? And if you look at how perhaps some of the most industrialized nations have behaved. You look at the Kyoto Protocol, for example, which was never ratified by a big industrial nation, one of the biggest polluters in the world like the United States. Then we move to the Paris Agreement. And again, you look at how the big industrial nations have behaved when it comes to ratifying these treaties, yet we are always on the forefront. How do you respond to critics who say that perhaps South Africa is too quick to always sign off and be signatories to some of these treaties?
I think South Africa is basically a compliant country. So whatever what is happening in other countries, international countries, and also South Africa forms part of international networks. So we obviously cannot be able to do our own thing in South Africa. We have to do our own thing. We have to sort of act locally, but also think globally, and also look at the international policies and that have been set. So yes, South Africa signs for agreements, and one of the agreements that have signed in COP26 was to ensure that the South Africa is actually moving. They start to implement the just transition, to roll out the just transition. Hence, the Presidential Commission on Climate Change is actually also happening. So I think the critics will always come, but the critics would come. But at the same time, it's also about ensuring that how best we sort of move away from the current system, which is mitigating climate change, but also aligning ourselves with the international standards, because we cannot implement our own policies in silos. They have to be aligned with some international standards in order to ensure that whatever we do in South Africa does not impact the relations that we have with other international countries. So I think South Africa also, the other issue is the issue of implementation of these policies. I think that's one of the major challenges that we have. We are very good in terms of policy formulation and making and aligning ourselves with other international standards. But when it comes to implementation, I think we still have a long way to go. So, which is something that we need to look into to ensure that how do we implement our policies, but also align them with other international policies in other countries.
Thabo Sibeko, thanks so much for talking to us about the impact of climate change and also the Presidential Climate Change Commission's consultations with communities on a framework for a just transition. Now, the just transition framework is meant to guide South Africa's response to the climate crisis and also to advise citizens on the path that the country should take to move to a low-carbon society. And that proposal is currently open for public comment until the 29th of April 2022. So please, if you can, take a look and give your comments and input as well. It's